The Night Tracker. As soon as my master Octavius let me outside, I felt the breeze of the wind touch my whiskers. I cared for him, and the rest of his family as if they were my blood mother who I unfortunately never met, or at least I don't remember her face. She was of no doubt, however, a black cat like me. My masters had cared for me for about 8 years, making me a little bit older than your average feline. But when I paid attention to the environment once again, its coolness gave me a warm sensation in my heart. For the wilderness was my true love, and it was my home, where I could be amongst friends without very much fear. While walking through squirrel territory, I smelled a welcoming scent. A chipmunk was certainly near me, and I was determined to find him. For I don't like my master's food. It tastes like nutrition that was frozen and warmed up again. Not fresh at all. The taste of fresh flesh was much superior. Crouching down on the leaf-filled ground, where a lone beetle quickly passed me, I centered my green eyes on my prey. For this would be a hunt to remember, as always. This chipmunk could be my next prey. To be frank, I've lost count of how many of them I have hunted. Immediately following the creature's movement south, I disembarked straight after him, while the winds began racing past my face, faster than a cardinal flying away from the winter. It was a rush few people really felt. The chase after my food continued for quite a long time, until he went inside a little log. I then felt angry and hit the log countless times with my paw, hoping it would be enough. After about 4 hits, the creature began to thrash away again. He probably was trying to get his breath back, something I don't really do a lot. Like my lioness cousins, I can run for miles and not feel fatigued. When the prey turned to the right to a series of bushes, I knew it was my time to strike, and I pounced directly on top of him, reaching his upper body and biting on his neck, cracking it like a nut. The spasms the creature made instilled a slight sadness in me. For I didn't enjoy taking this chipmunk's life. It was just in my nature. A sort of appeasement to my ancestors, and a way to get in touch with my wild side. Before eating its organs, I promised him that nothing would go to waste as I sank my fangs into his body. While finishing up, I got to his chest area and smelled a strange scent several meters away from me. It smelled of fear and freshness. I was dumbstruck as the trees around simply became devoid of life, while the birds flew away. I could no longer hear all the chirping surrounding me. So, in an act of curiosity, I decided to investigate. As I ran closer to the scent, I saw the source of the stench, and was it petrifying. The corpse was drenched in crimson blood, and when I spotted a few areas of cleanliness, the details were obviously pointing to a feline. The white paws with claws still out, a few brown spots on her stomach, and whiskers sticking out her face. I could tell it was female for obvious reasons. She had been murdered recently, not hunted, because the cut marks resembled a knife, which measured up from the poor creature's leg to her neck area. A murderer was near, and I was determined to find them. After putting my paw on my fellow cat, I licked her so that she could feel a feline's embrace to the afterlife. I inhaled and picked up the scent which highlighted throughout the forest, which was vast, but luckily a cat's sense of scent was uncanny, only matched by those ferocious dogs. Traversing through the scent patterns led me to an area I was less familiar with. It was a lot louder than the rest of the environment, and it appeared that lights were moving at very high speeds, and the stench that emitted from them made my nostrils flare up. It was natural yet tampered with, just like the food my masters feed me. Whatever it was altered by humans. Upon exiting the vicinity of this strange place, the scent unfortunately disappeared. Luckily, a friend of mine appeared. He was a raccoon. I had come to call him scavenger because, well, that's what he was. There wasn't a fly that could escape him. But his appearance this early was surprising. Usually, his species doesn't appear until the evening. He turned to me with a piece of something that smelled very, very sweet. His face was as you expect from a raccoon, but he was slightly thinner than your average specimen. Also, worth remembering was the chain mark on his leg. I never asked where he got it, and he never told me much. So, I tried to keep it to myself. "Hey, happy Halloween," he said excitedly with his whiskers moving after finishing his meal. "Good afternoon, my friend." I stared at him silently for a while before I enlarged my pupils and greeted him. Thanks for reminding me it's the day of costumes amongst the humans. That's why one of my family members at home was so excited, he wouldn't stop talking about it. Well, except for when he coughed. Yeah, well said, Midnight. He exposed his fangs as he spoke. That means free candy for us. Hope your friend gets better. Likewise. He's a pure soul. Scavenger then toppled the ground and pulled another chocolate wrapped in green plastic. He offered me some too, which I politely declined. I desired to see if he knew more of what happened to my poor brethren. Happened to smell anything strange here recently? Something pungent and sour? Yes, for a while actually. It started all the way back in September. He spoke confidently as he was scratching his gray head. What? Since September? I stopped his speech immediately. This can't be possible. How do you not tell me about this? I knew you'd act like this, but I suppose you're right. There's probably been about 6 or 7 murders now. Poor things, you know? This doesn't make any sense. Why wasn't I able to pick up the scent earlier then? Can you take me to the latest victim? I replied, blinking rapidly. I must apprehend this monster. Sure, but that's it. This kind of stuff creeps me out, come on. He was eating another piece of chocolate as he turned his head to me. We both walked to where the scent might be, and he left his nest of chocolates behind. The smell was really irritating me. For 30 minutes we traversed the forest and greeted all the somber-looking birds. Our friend the blue jay greeted us and told us about the latest murder. How he was startled and came home an hour later due to its occurrence. He also told us to be wary of any humans that might come, because today they would be much more excited and wild. We concurred, wished him well, and departed. Scavenger stopped and touched his furry neck, looking at me as he pointed to the way, before he softly spoke. Be careful, Midnight, this is a most gruesome sight. He rapidly ran away back to the safe side. I thanked him and walked into a site surrounded by bushes without leaves, and an old worn hammock attached to an old oak tree. Parallel to it was the site Scavenger warned me about. A fellow black cat, like me, was slaughtered, and his internals were splattered throughout the scene. There was more that I don't wish to tell you. My brother looked youthful as his teeth weren't fully developed. I then bravely came closer to the corpse, licked him on the head, and put my paw on him. Meowing loudly, for this ruthless killer was not getting away from me this time. I have picked up his smelly scent, and that's all I need now. I told my brother that I would avenge him, and all my other fellow felines. While walking away, I felt sick to my stomach and wanted to remember my human brother Octavius. How he'd feed me every day and pet me so softly. His heart felt pure, like Ben's, and his love for me was unconditional. Upon attempting to contrast them to this murderer, I was unable to do it. How one race could be so vastly different made me realize exactly why we animals fear them so much. This monster just amplifies that behavior. Chasing after the scent for about an hour led me to another neighborhood completely foreign to me. I could spot trick-or-treaters trying to get candy. After that, I thought about where Octavius was and wished him well. I ran quickly to the back of one of these houses, to the point where I spotted a large wooden fence that was easy to pounce over. Upon landing on the leaf-filled ground, the scent smelled stronger than ever. I felt a determination to locate the area and find this monster so he could answer for his crimes. Until I reached a peculiar-looking shack with a garage smelling of that same sour scent. I knew I'd discovered my prey, but I honestly felt afraid, for this wasn't going to be an average chipmunk. It was going to a human, and not just any normal one, but a ferocious one with the heart of a demon. I put myself together and quietly headed for the garage. When I looked into the garage, I spotted a large tool shed and an old blue car with rust surrounding it. That was all normal until I saw a bloody chainsaw and knives lined up next to the killer himself. I could only see his back, but that was sufficient to make my tail stand up. His spine was very bony, and his complexion was quite pale. The workstation he was working at was the true source of the scent. I saw the corpse of one of my brothers, and I knew if I let my emotions get to me, I'd be torn to shreds. vigilantly moving alongside the piles of leaves in front of the shack. I heard the killer laugh, and the sound that came from his voice belonged to a man who had smoked far too much. I could also make out his hands, which were covered in blood. I knew it'd be best if I sneaked up on him. So, without much thought or hesitation, I moved up and pounced on him. Unfortunately, he had a sharp ear and turned around, attempting to slice my head off. In his right hand lay a 9-inch knife with blood on it. "Ah, hello, kitty kitty," he stated in his clown-like voice. "Welcome to my humble abode." Filled with anguish, I spotted his dark apron and an old rigid white t-shirt. His eyes were brown, and his hair had a greasy, oily tint to it. His age was probably of a 40-year-old man, but honestly, I didn't care. I just wish he could understand my speech, so I could tell him exactly how much I'd come to hate him. For his actions were irredeemable, and couldn't be forgotten. Regardless, I just decided to hiss with all my lung power. He laughed, hissed back at me, and screeched like a harpy. I didn't expect to have another toy to play with so early on. He laughed, hissed back at me, and screeched like a harpy before he spoke. I told myself not to fear, and to be strong. For I knew what my duty was today. I thought about all those poor felines he murdered and dilated my pupils attempting to strike at him. After landing on his face, I scratched his chin and jaw area. I almost got him in the eyes until he threw me off with his filthy hands. I could smell the stench from him, and it wasn't just blood, it was pure evil. Well, got some fight there. The man smiled, exposing his yellow teeth as he spoke. He sounded like a man from those cowboy movies Octavius would watch sometimes. I hissed again at him, until he exclaimed, "You want to know why I choose animals instead of people now? 'Cause it's easier to cover my tracks when I slay you fur balls compared to people. Not to mention I never have to worry about getting sent to prison even if it's illegal. Never heard of someone getting the death penalty for murdering animals. Hell, they hurt me in defense more than any human I've hunted in a long while, I swear it. Ain't that something?" He laughed like crazy after he spoke. As he told me this, I refused to imagine that he murdered people too. How he would subject them to the same mindless slaughter he did to my brothers and sisters. But I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. This is a lunatic I'm dealing with after all. They do say they start with animals then go to people. But this time he decided to twist the deal. The maniac took his knife and tried to stab me with it, and I jumped out the way, biting his hand, causing him to scream in agony. I enjoyed that as he suffered like his victims did. I pounced on his chest area and scratched him immensely. He was trying to reach for his chainsaw, but I bit his wrist. At that point, he was just grinning, causing me to get terrified for a bit. While on his body I kept clawing at him over and over again, mauling his face up as I did so. He was just lying there on that muddy ground. "Mercy, mercy, please. You got me," the serial killer begged, cowering in intense fear. In that instant, I was fueled with rage and a sensation of such animosity I almost wanted to kill him, to end his reign of terror on this earth for eternity. But that's when I remembered my family and friends. How they would feel if they were in this position, how would they react? I couldn't take that chance. I didn't want to become a monster like this man. So, I did what I thought was right, and simply got off his chest. Walking away, I could still hear his laughs on the floor, while he lay bleeding on the ground. When I got back inside the forest, I felt a rejuvenation in the land. That an evil force had been eradicated from this place for good. I could even hear birds wildly chirping despite the evening coming upon us. I marked the territory as my own. I also hoped to myself that the monster would stop slaughtering my fellow felines. I really did. But if he started killing humans again, I prayed that the authorities would stop him for good. For that's not my job, not my destiny. The forests and my family is all I care for. Upon entering the area of lights, I spotted Scavenger again. He came to me, and we hugged one another. "The forest, it feels better, is it done? He'll never hurt us again. I promise," I replied while licking myself. "Thank you, Midnight," the raccoon said as he put his claws on me. We can all sleep better because of you. Have a good night. Best regards to your family. Thanks you too, my friend. I'd do it again if I had to. We parted ways. I had missed my family a great deal. I had risked my life today but had survived. But instead of going home immediately, I wanted to check out my territory for a while. It was a new moon after all. I'll be home in a couple hours. That sounds perfect to me. Nights of Fear. I usually have to do some explaining when someone finds out that my official title is Head of On-Site Security. Most people assume that the title means that I'm in charge of all of the security aspects of the amusement park I'm employed at. That isn't actually the case. The security department is divided into two divisions. The division that I'm the head of, on-site security, is the one that is out in the park handling issues that come up, which the majority of the time are caused by the park guests. My team takes care of things such as personal belongings being stolen, breaking up arguments and fights, and removing drunk people from the park. The other division, Operations Security, handles the security issues that are more business-related. Verification of the validity of park passes, loss prevention in the stores and restaurants, monitoring employee activities, those sorts of things. There's surprisingly little overlap between the duties of the two sides of the department. The big exception to this is during the annual Halloween events that are held in the park, specifically those that take place after sundown. This is by far the most difficult time of the year for security, and it requires both divisions to be temporarily combined into one to make sure that there's enough coverage and manpower for the issues that inevitably occur. There's a tricky balance between allowing guests to have a good time during the more adult-oriented event and making sure that both they and the park itself are safe while they do so. Before I go any further, I should mention that I'm bound by a large number of non-disclosure agreements. Breaking those would inevitably lead to a number of lawsuits and possibly criminal prosecution, and I have a family to think about. Because of this, I can't give the name of the amusement park that I work for or mention any real names. There should be enough here to connect the dots, however. What I can say is that, while it's a smaller park than, say, the various Disney and Universal parks, it is large enough that it attracts a high number of visitors each year during the summer season. That number goes down sharply once school starts in the fall. Due to this decline, the park shifts to only being open on Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays until it shuts down completely for the winter beginning the first week of November. Starting in September, the park is given a Halloween-themed makeover. That makeover is kept family-friendly during the daylight operating hours. The various cartoon mascots that wander the park wear costumes, tents are set up that children can trick or treat at, and decorations cover pretty much everything. While the water rides are already closed for the season, the water inside of them is temporarily dyed orange or green. A maze made of hay bales is constructed near the park's side entrance. It really is a good time for both children and their parents. Just before sundown, the park is closed for an hour. Crews work during this time to remove or modify many of the decorations to make the park look and feel much more sinister. A small army of actors arrive dressed in macabre costumes. New haunted house attractions are prepped for visitors, and menus at the various restaurants and food stops are changed to include less food and far more alcoholic options. This is the park's annual Nights of Fear promotion. Again, not the actual name, but close enough for you to connect the dots. Open to anyone 18 or old, it's a huge moneymaker that is also a huge pain in the ass for security. The atmosphere is designed to be creepy as well as rather adult-oriented. The actors that are hired for the season roam the park in designated areas called scare zones, where they jump out at unsuspecting guests and try to look threatening instead of ridiculous. Others work inside of attractions that are basically flashier versions of those haunted houses or haunted walks that pop up around Halloween. Here's how this all breaks down with regards to the incident. You have a security team that has been greatly reduced in size because the park is only open 3 days a week, not to mention one that isn't used to working together because it's been cobbled together from 2 different divisions. The event takes place at night, which is far more difficult to monitor than the activities that take place during the day. There's an influx of temporary employees in the form of the scare actors. The park itself has been decorated, often with large and complex displays that can block cameras and create blind spots. Finally, there's alcohol. Lots and lots of alcohol. It's a difficult situation for everyone behind the scenes. The security staff is stretched thin, and there are inevitably incidents every single night, many of which we don't find out about until the next day. To say that it's an all-hands-on-deck situation is putting it mildly. 9 days ago, we had just passed the 11 o'clock mark during one such night. Normally I patrol the park with the majority of the other security guards during event nights. There's a lot of ground to cover and not many people to do it with. I need to coordinate security while also handling issues personally. It's one of the few things that I enjoy about the Nights of Fear event. I get to be outside in the fresh air instead of seated behind my desk in my stuffy office. I had just returned to the office to swap out a dead walkie-talkie. We typically use cell phones to communicate, but some of the haunted house attractions don't play well with digital signals, so we carry the walkies as well. I belted on the new unit and turned to go back out the door, but I was stopped when one of the two guards watching the security camera feeds called me over. He quickly rewound a clip and played it back for me. It was in black and white, which was typical when the cameras switched themselves over to night vision mode. A small group of people walked by a store that I recognized as one of the gift shops in the back half of the park. There didn't seem to be anything out of the ordinary, and I opened my mouth to say so. I closed it again and frowned as a figure walked into view. It was a person dressed in a costume. It was hard to tell from the position of the camera, but he seemed to be wearing a pumpkin-like mask and was dressed in a long black coat. He was holding either a baseball bat or some kind of long club. I picked up a clipboard that was hanging from a nearby hook and quickly scanned through the contents. It was a complete listing of all the actors and the costumes that they had been assigned. Each was themed to a particular area of the park. Zombie costumes outside of the rave from the grave haunted house, werewolf costumes for the pack hunt scare zone, that sort of thing. There was nothing on the list that fit the description of what I was seeing on the video. With an annoyed sigh, I went back out into the park. If it wasn't one of the actors, it was a guest wearing a costume. There were strict rules against that to make sure that everyone knew who was part of the event and who wasn't. During the day, the children were allowed to dress up, but no adults were allowed to wear costumes at any time. Most of the other guards in the park were busy, and the office wasn't far from the place where the camera had recorded the individual. I decided that I'd take care of it myself. It shouldn't take long, and from that general area of the park I could easily make my way over to the heavier traffic areas. I radioed for the control room to send a copy of the video over to my phone. If the guest was no longer wearing the mask, I might still be able to track him down based on the clothes he was wearing. As I walked past the entrance to one of the roller coasters, an actor dressed as a deranged clown stepped out of the shrubs. I nodded at him and pointed at the green glow-in-the-dark lanyard around my neck. He returned the nod and went back into the bushes. All of the park staff were wearing the same lanyard. They were a variation of the lanyards that guests could purchase if they didn't want to be jump-scared in the various scare zones throughout the park. Those guests were issued glowing orange ones, and the staff wore green. I followed along the path wrapping around the roller coaster, passing by groups of guests as I went. I looked closely at each person, but I didn't see anyone that matched what I had seen on the camera feed. Roughly 10 minutes after leaving the office, I arrived at my destination. The store wasn't one of the ones that was open for Nights of Fear. The windows were dark, and a large closed sign hung on the door. I hadn't really expected the costumed guest to still be there, and he wasn't. Still, it was a place to start. My cell phone vibrated as it received the camera feed video. I stepped off of the path and into the store doorway so that I was out of the way of the crowd. Digging my phone out of my pocket, I watched the video again. I noticed something that I hadn't the first time. Right before the figure walked out of frame, he turned slightly and walked at an angle that would take him off the main path. I looked in the direction he had gone in. There was a gate in the fence that separated the public from a maintenance area. The gate was closed, but the padlock was lying on the concrete in front of it. I retrieved the lock and examined it closely. It hadn't been unlocked. It had been broken. This was no longer a simple matter of a guest wearing a costume. I pulled the walkie-talkie off of my belt and radioed the control room to request backup. One of the most important rules of Nights of Fear security was to never go into a potentially dangerous situation alone. It took a while for anyone to answer, much longer than it should have. When someone finally got back to me, I was informed that a brawl had broken out between two groups of college kids at the other side of the park. Everyone was either committed there or was dealing with one of the other smaller issues that were happening. That meant that I had to make a choice. Either I continued my search alone, going against both policy and common sense, or I risked losing the trespasser by waiting for other security guards to become available. Under normal circumstances, I would have gladly opted for the latter instead of the former. The problem was that this wasn't a normal circumstance. The maintenance area that had been broken into went directly under one of the roller coasters. If you were familiar with it, the area was safe enough. If you weren't, however, there were multiple places where the coaster track came down to ground level at the bottom of large hills. At the speed that they traveled at, the cars could easily injure or kill a person in their path. There was a very good reason that maintenance areas like this one were only to be used when the ride was shut down. Even if the trespasser was able to avoid being struck by the ride, what if he somehow caused damage to the track, or obstructed it in some way? That would endanger the riders. I considered things for a moment before swearing in frustration and radioing the office to have the roller coaster temporarily stopped. I would have to go in, sweep the area to make sure that no one was still in there, and lock it back down. There was a time limit as well. A lot of inebriated people would be waiting in line, and for the sake of the park employees operating the ride, it was best to make sure they weren't waiting too long. I waited for a few minutes before I got confirmation from the office that the ride was stopped and that all cars were off the track. At the same time, I watched as the green lights above the roller coaster station turned red. Nodding to myself, I took out my flashlight and proceeded into the maintenance area. It was oddly quiet. Out in the main areas of the park, the guests and rides kept up a constant high level of noise. The maintenance area was fenced off, which, combined with the coaster being shut down, muted much of the cacophony of sounds. It was almost a shock when I realized that I could hear my own footsteps. I had only been walking for a minute or two when I noticed another noise. It was the sound of metal scraping on concrete. Because of the way it echoed, it was difficult to pin down where it was coming from. I stopped and listened while I got my bearings. Most of the area under the roller coaster was hard compacted dirt rather than concrete. The only places where the sound could be coming from were around the support struts from the ride, which seemed unlikely, or the large poured pad that the maintenance sheds were secured to. There weren't a lot of lights, and the ones that were spaced throughout the maintenance area didn't do much. I was used to walking through the park at night long after the last guest had left. A lot of people would find that unnerving or, I don't know, creepy, but I've always found it to be relaxing. This was different. I grew more and more nervous with each step, and I started to get jumpy around every shadow. I stopped walking and mentally scolded myself for acting like a child before continuing on. The noise stopped as I came to the sheds. It was replaced by a new sound, a low and almost inaudible whimpering. I hurried forward. Clearly someone was hurt. I came to a 6-foot wide gap between two of the sheds and abruptly halted. I couldn't tell what I was looking at. The space was dark, but I could just make out a large figure standing at the far end with his back turned towards me. Remembering the flashlight that I was holding, I shined the beam forward just in time to see the person raise his arm up over his head. The light reflected off something metal in the person's hand as the arm swung downward. It was a thick piece of rebar. The pull struck something that I couldn't see around due to the man's bulk. The whimpering abruptly ceased. I pulled my taser free from its holster. While security at the park didn't typically carry weapons of any kind, an exception was made during the Nights of Fear events. This was because the crimes that happened during those events tended to be more violent, and were sometimes threatening to the guards themselves. I identified myself and ordered the figure to turn around and face me. There was a long pause where nothing happened. I was just about to give the order again when the man slowly did as he had been told. I nearly dropped the taser. The man was tall, nearly 7 feet. He was wearing a long black coat that was buttoned up to his neck, and he had the pants and boots to match. His hands were gloved, and in his right hand was the rebar pole that I had caught a glimpse of. All of these details I took in peripherally. My gaze was locked on his head. The security feed had made me think that he was wearing a pumpkin mask. This wasn't the case. His head was shaved, and it was painted with orange and black makeup that made it resemble a warped jack-o'-lantern. His eyes, though, they just weren't there. I don't know how to describe it. Where his eyes should have been were 2 dark voids that the light from the flashlight couldn't penetrate. I stared at them, not really comprehending what I was looking at. His appearance was so striking that it took me a bit to notice the blood dripping from the rebar. I lowered the flashlight slightly so that the beam was focused on the metal. Bits of flesh and hair were stuck to it. I remembered the whimpering that had been silenced, and tilted my head to look beyond the man. I could barely make out the remains of a person on the ground. The head had been mangled to the point that it was barely recognizable as human. The man started to advance towards me. With every step that he took forward, I took 2 back. I still had the taser pointed at him, but I doubted that it would do any good. Not only was the man massive, but he was also heavily clothed from his neck down. The probes would have a hard time making a good connection. I had to try, though, and it needed to be before he got too close. I pointed the taser at his center of mass and fired. The probes sank into his coat in the chest region, and the electricity began to flow. The man stopped moving and looked down at them. He brushed at them with his hand like they were flies, and they came free of the coat and clattered to the ground. With that done, he started to come towards me once again, the rebar still clutched in his hand. I hurriedly backed out of the way as he approached, ready to run at any moment, but when he reached the end of the small alley, he simply walked past me without pausing. I stared up at him in confusion as he went by. My walkie-talkie emitted a burst of static. With surprising speed, the man turned, reached out, and pulled it free of my belt. He squeezed his hand and crushed the device flat. The noise ceased. He opened his fingers and let the broken parts fall to the ground before continuing on his way. Taking one last look at him, I hurried down the short path to the body on the ground. To my surprise, the person was still alive. I wouldn't have thought that anyone could have survived the wounds that they had suffered, but it was clear that wouldn't be the case for much longer. The bludgeoning had been so thorough that it wasn't possible to determine things such as gender and age. They were just this lump of blood and flesh. I looked back over my shoulder at the man as he turned and disappeared behind one of the sheds. The amount of strength that this horrible act required was unbelievable. I thought back to his eyes, those black holes with nothing in them, and I shuddered. The remains of the person died a few minutes later. There wasn't anything that I could do for them except make sure that they didn't die alone. Once they were gone, I hurried out of the space between the sheds to try to find the killer, but he was no longer there. With my radio broken, I didn't have much of a choice about how to proceed. I rushed back to the office and called the local police. Over the next few hours, my staff and I looked through the security camera footage as closely as humanly possible. There was no sign of the man, and we couldn't find any video of him leaving the maintenance area. When the police searched it for the rest of the night and into the morning, they came up empty-handed. Everyone was at a loss as to how he had disappeared. Because of what had happened, the local police began to patrol with the security staff every night the park was open. That was 9 days ago. A week after the first killing, we caught sight of the man on the security cameras again. This time it was in a different part of the park, just outside of one of the haunted house attractions. I took 3 other guards with me and rushed over, but he was gone again by the time we got there. Behind the house, pushed up against a dumpster hidden from view of the guests, was another dead body. Last night was the 3rd killing. The staff watching the cameras didn't see the man initially, but a mutilated corpse was found at the top of a waterfall in one of the water attractions. We reviewed the tapes, and we discovered a clip of less than a second where you could see the man walk behind one of the rocks in the attraction. Tonight, a member of my staff and a police officer managed to catch the man in the act. He had dragged a woman in her early 20s behind a carousel by her hair. They got there just as he was about to stab her with a broken bottle. The officer immediately opened fire with his sidearm, and 2 of the shots connected with the target. The man staggered before falling to one knee. The officer put his empty gun back into its holster and took out a pair of handcuffs to arrest him as the security guard radioed in for backup and to have the ride stopped. When he got close, the man suddenly stood back up and grabbed the officer by the throat. He turned to one side and held out the struggling officer out towards the still spinning carousel. One of the horses came racing by and smashed in the side of his head. I could hear the riders screaming all the way from the park entrance. None of this was caught by the cameras. It was relayed to me by the security guard that witnessed it. The man left him alive for reasons that I don't understand. He did, however, pause long enough to jam the remains of the broken bottle into the woman's chest before disappearing once again into the night. Today is Sunday. The park will be closed for the next 4 days. When Friday comes around again, though, I have to believe that there will be more killing. Before I sat down to write this, I put in a call to the head of operations for the company that owns the amusement park. I'm still trying to process what he told me. Despite the danger to the guests, the park won't be canceling the Nights of Fear event. It all comes down to dollars and cents, you see. This is one of the most profitable times of the year for the park, and attendance has actually gone up since the killings started. I don't know if people think it's just a publicity stunt, or if it simply makes it more exciting for them to think that they're in the presence of a real serial killer. Whatever the case, the police won't be shutting it down, either. The event is good for the local economy, not just the park. The people who make the decisions here in town aren't willing to give up their cash cow. I'm going to be ordering my staff not to engage with the face-painted man. So far he hasn't attacked any of us, although I think he was close to doing so when I used my taser on him. We're going to stay out of his way and hope that the police present at the park will be able to stop him. I'm not willing to needlessly throw away the lives of my people. Someone is stalking the Nights of Fear, and there's not a damn thing any of us can do about it. Treehouse of Terror. Halloween, such a simple concept yet something that has brought countless years of joy to me. There is something about taking all of society's standards and throwing them out the window for 24 hours that is just so absurdly fun. Children going to strangers' houses and taking candy from them, something that would be barred any other time of the year, is suddenly standard. It is one of the only times where you could be in an elevator with Captain America, a sexy nurse and a zombie, and nobody bats an eye. However, there is one Halloween tradition that has stuck with me my whole life. That is the annual Simpsons Treehouse of Horror specials. Nothing combines the fun and fear of Halloween quite like Homer recreating the Raven or Ned Flanders prancing around as the devil. They were a staple in my household growing up, and I still consume them like candy each and every Halloween. That was why when I heard that my local station was going to be running a Treehouse of Horror marathon Halloween night, I was pumped beyond belief. However, looking back, I wish I had done something else, anything other than witnessing what I did. Halloween night passed as it always did. I spent the night watching classic horror movies and handing out candy to the occasional trick or treater. As the marathon neared its start, I found myself feeling like an 8-year-old boy all over again. I set up my snacks, including the leftover Halloween candy that I overstocked on for exactly this purpose, and got ready for a night of fun. For the first few hours it was nothing short of spooky nostalgic magic. However, I did not fully comprehend the full magnitude of what I was entering. With 30 specials I was in for about 15 hours of television, and I have to admit that is a bit of an undertaking even for me. Eventually I succumbed to boredom and sugar crash and fell asleep. I was awoken a while later by a commercial that was louder than it had any right to be. It was about 3:30 in the morning and one of the specials was just ending. I was about to throw in the towel because they were getting into the later specials that, I'm sorry, just don't have the same level or horror or humor as the older specials, but something caught my eye. The special had an opening that I had never seen before, and I was intrigued as which one it could be. The special opened with the family watching TV. Kent Brockman was just finishing up the nightly news when suddenly a loud grandfather clock in the living room began to chime. The Simpsons all at once went into a strange trance and in unison said, "It's time." All of a sudden the animation became much sharper and more fluid. They clearly had hired an outside professional to do the scene. One by one the family members started to convulse and transform into horrifying creatures. Marge's body started to lengthen and twist, becoming serpent-like. Her eyes became red with yellow lining and she had become a snake monster. Bart was next with his back popping out and developing a hunch. His skin turned green and he grew gills and flippers, becoming sort of a creature of the Black Lagoon-type monster. He feels his crooked back and makes a joke about how his chiropractor is not going to be happy about this. Homer begins growling and claws erupt from his fingers. His mouth becomes a snout and brown hair erupts from all over his body, covering him everywhere except the top of his head, leaving him effectively still bald. This caused him to issue his trademark, "Doe!" Lisa stood awaiting her transformation only for a simple witch's hat to appear on her head. I will admit this got a good laugh from me. Finally Maggie floated into the air and started turning into a bat while preforming a deep demonic laugh that sent a very real chill through my blood. Suddenly all of their eyes snapped wide open and they simply stared at the screen. It disturbed me how intense and creepy their stares were, because it truly gave me the feeling that they were staring at me and not just the screen. One by one they started to speak, with each character delivering a single sentence. "Won't you join us? For a terror the likes of which you have never felt. These tales are not for the faint of heart. We have delved deep into your mind and pulled out your darkest fears. If you don't wish to subject yourself to this, then we would humbly advise you to stop now. You have been warned." All at once they leapt at the screen and blood tinkled down, spelling, "Treehouse of Terror." As it went to commercial I found myself needing a minute to catch my breath slightly. I have seen all of the specials including the new one that aired a few days prior, and this is not one of them. I had never even heard of Treehouse of Terror before. Under different circumstances I would have thought it was a cheap knockoff, but the voice actors and animation budget were there. All my thoughts of calling it a night went out the window, and I knew I had to keep watching. That may have been the best opening to one of these I have ever seen. It was genuinely funny and had the creepy quality that many of the later specials were missing. I sat back down and waited with renewed vigor for the special to resume. The fifth segment was simply titled, "We Be Bored." A mediocre pun, but that was par for the course for these sketches. It opened in the elementary school's auditorium where Principal Skinner was holding an assembly. He was going over the new terms and conditions for the school's computer operating system in extensive and excruciating detail. Most of the students were either asleep or close to it. At the top of the auditorium a group of students including Bart, Lisa, Milhouse, Nelson and Martin sat. Everyone with the exception of Martin were holding on to consciousness by a thread. Bart looked to his right and saw a small crawl space with an ominous red light shining. Bart convinces the other students to join him in escaping through the crawl space. Nelson drags Martin along so he couldn't rat them out to Skinner. They make their way through the crawl space and find themselves in Skinner's office. They ransack his desk until they discover their permanent records. Bart asks what his says and Lisa says that it looks like Skinner just slammed his head into the book and held it up, revealing a perfect imprint of his angry face. Upon further investigation they discover a confiscated Ouija board. The group gets excited and decides to play, forcing the reluctant Martin to join in. The scene plays out with them asking the board different questions. Milhouse asks if he will ever have a girlfriend and the cursor continually slams into the word no. They ask when Martin will die and the cursor spells out the word soon. Martin begins to panic and takes his hand of the cursor. An ominous wind begins blowing in the room and the board starts floating in the air. The cursor moves on its own, spelling out, "You didn't say goodbye." Shadowy arms and legs push out of the board and it rushes at Martin, throwing him onto a coat rack, impaling him. Nelson tries to fight the board, but its shadows wrap around Nelson's arm and forces him to punch himself in the face while chanting, "Stop tormenting yourself." Nelson's bloody body falls to the floor and Milhouse turns to Bart and Lisa. "There is no chance of me surviving this one, is there?" he asks them. The Ouija board appears behind him and says, "No." He then grabs Milhouse's neck and snaps it. The board slowly advances on the trembling Bart and Lisa. The two hold each other and say goodbye to one another. The board suddenly stops and says, "Oh, goodbye then." The shadows disappear and the board lies harmlessly on the floor. Bart and Lisa shrug and leave. The two are about to walk back through the auditorium doors when Skinner walks through the doors and scalds them, saying he is now going to have to start over for them. Bart asks if they can just say that they accept and be done with it. Skinner reluctantly agrees and escorts them back to class. He takes them into a dark classroom and shuts the door with a sinister smile on his face. This is where things take an extremely uncomfortable turn. All music and sound stops and the camera begins moving back down the hall towards the auditorium. It pushes in the doors and reveals all of the other students still in the room, however they are no longer sleeping. All of the students, and extremely pale with their eyes wide in terror. They are all completely motionless, and it is clear that they are dead. The camera slowly pans, revealing all their dead faces frozen with the last look of utter terror that they will ever experience. As the commercial break started, I sat there stunned. The Simpsons had explored dark territory before, but that final scene was downright disturbing. I was shocked but becoming more interested because I had been hoping for this for years. A truly frightening Halloween special. I was invested now, and I couldn't wait for more. The commercials ended and the second segment started. The title of this one was Dawn of the Unfed. Wow, they were really starting to stretch for these puns now. It opened on the nuclear power plant where Lenny, Carl, and Charlie are staring at the clock that is about to strike noon. They grow more desperate as the seconds click by and they complain about being extremely hungry. The clock strikes noon, sounding the lunch bell, and the group rush towards the lunchroom. Their path becomes blocked by Mr. Burns, who informs them that there is a problem with the reactor, and they need to fix it before they can eat. Charlie points out that by law they have a right to refuse unsafe work. Mr. Burns smiles and explains that they never read the terms and conditions of their contracts, and that they had waived that right. The group let out a sigh and get into biohazard suits. They try to fix the core, but it springs a strong leak, sending noxious green gas in the chamber. They begin to panic, but Carl does a reading and discovers that the radiation levels are leveling out to the exact amount that the suits can take. As long as the radiation in the area stays exactly the same, they would be alright. A sudden beep gets their attention, and they slowly look over to see the lunchroom on the other side of the glass where Homer just put his lunch in the microwave. "Why is the reactor next to the lunchroom?" Lenny asks. "Budget cuts," Carl responds. The trio's suits start to burst open, exposing them to toxic gas. The gas melts their skin, turns them into a zombie-like mutant. They break through the glass into the lunchroom and begin hissing the word, "hungry," at Homer. "Hey, no way, I bought this TV dinner and I am not sharing it." "Oh, don't worry, we plan to eat you," Charlie rasps. "Okay, we can split the green beans," Homer replies fearfully. The three rush at Homer, who flees down the hall. Homer can't run anymore and attempts to hide in some pipes behind him. However, no matter how hard he squeezes, he is too fat to fit into between them. Giving up, he runs to the suggestion box down the hall and writes down, "Please make hiding places large enough for the average American citizen." He puts the message in the box and runs down to his office and barricades the door. The three zombies begin scratching at the door and try to coax Homer out. "Let us in, Homer, we are so hungry." "We will make it quick, we promise, just open the door." Once again the music cuts out and the scene cuts to different parts of the plant where several bodies lay, and the only sound are drops of blood hitting the floor. The scene cuts back to Homer's office where the zombies are still whispering for Homer to open the door. The camera slowly pans to Homer, who is dead. His eyes are lifeless and his face is extremely shrunken, in showing that he had starved to death over time. The scene cuts out on that disturbing image. I rushed to the washroom as the commercials began, and started breathing heavily, debating if I was going to spill back out all of the Halloween candy. Each time I closed my eyes I saw Homer's shrunken face, which looked just like the real ones I had seen in history textbooks. I found myself shaking and I didn't know how to stop. I had been watching gruesome horror movies since I was 5 years old, and I had never had anything affect me like that, especially not a cartoon. There was just something about the images of those dead children, of Homer's emaciated body, that just felt too wrong, too real. I debated on turning off the TV, but no. I had come this far and I couldn't turn back now. I had to see this through to the end. This was after all just a simple cartoon. The final sketch was a complete departure from the first two, from anything Simpsons in fact. While the first two sketches had disturbing moments, they still carried the traditional references and humor expected from the series. This sketch contained no humor, and no genuine story. The entire sketch was in POV format, taking the perspective of an unseen character. They are sleeping in a tent when Bart and Lisa come in and tell them it's time. They get up and begin following them through the woods. This goes on for several minutes, and during this time there is no dialogue, and no jokes of any kind. Occasionally Bart or Lisa will turn back and stare at you. Again I get that strange feeling I had in the opening, where they are not just looking at the screen but right at me. However, it was not simply the staring that was unsettling this time, but their expression. Their faces were filled with sorrow and empathy. It was the kind of look a child might give a beloved pet being taken to the vet to be put down. It filled me with both fear and sadness, the likes of which I have never felt before. After nearly 10 minutes they finally arrived at a mysterious dark cave. The two turned around but refused to look me in the eye, staring mournfully at the ground instead. "You need to go in alone," Bart said melancholically. "We can't go in, not yet anyway," Lisa said with equal sadness that was tinged with fear. The unseen protagonist walked into the cave and with increased weariness traversed the darkness. Each step away from the entrance brought more and more darkness until they stand on the precipice of utter blackness. It is there that the walking stopped, and they simply wait. Then emanating from the darkness came the sounds of heavy footsteps growing closer and closer. They moved at a slow and steady pace, growing louder, each step echoing through the cavity of my real chest. Through the dim light of the setting sun behind the POV I begin to notice a shadow in blackness. A phenomenon that I know is impossible, yet there was that shadow forming before my eyes. The shadow was the type that seemed to look like both nothing and yet everything at the same time. The formless mass that embodies your worst fears as if was made of it. It was a shadow of pure terror. It moved towards me and suddenly I seemed out of control of my own body and I felt myself convulsing. A slimy stream of drool and foam came from my mouth and my body began shaking. I hit the floor and everything went black. I awoke a few hours later to the light of dawn. The TV was still on, playing the marathon from the night before. However, I had no desire to watch it, not after what I saw. I pulled myself off the floor and found my shirt soaked with a combination of sweat and saliva. I have never had a history of epilepsy before, and I could not think of what I saw that might cause it. I picked up my phone and jumped online to see if anyone else witnessed the strange episode, but my searches came up blank. Could I have dreamt the whole thing? But if that was the case, why was I on the floor covered in my own drool? I don't know what I saw that night, but there are moments where I see random things that trigger my memory. Every time this happens I suffer a massive panic attack and nearly seize again before I can get a good picture of it. Whatever it was, it will haunt me for the rest of my days. I send this story to you all seeking answers. Did any of you see this episode? Did anyone else experience the same terror I felt? And above all, if I'm not alone in this, what did you see in that darkness?